Hello everyone, welcome back. This is How Did Russia Become an Empire? Great Northern War documentary by Kings and Generals. This is an older request and I apologize, I lost that list and I went through. I didn't lose it. I had added it with another document that I had for some reason. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and they're all in segments down here, so I'm just going to knock out the segments because I still have a lot of stuff to do tonight, apparently. Alright, video.
The Great Northern War marked the culmination of a tumultuous couple of centuries in Northern Europe. This war not only changed the balance of power in the region, but on the continent as a whole. At the end of the conflict, one of Europe's newest and most militarized powers lay in ruins, and from its ashes, an empire previously on the fringe of European affairs would start its explosive rise. Welcome to our video on the Great Northern War, on how the Swedish Empire ended and the Russian Empire rose, opening the way to a new era of European history. These long videos are extremely difficult to make, and we hope you'll grace us with your likes, comments, and shares. This conflict is absolutely packed with big names and big battles, and there's another place that goes even bigger. It's our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. You probably know it as the mobile game that plays like a console game, a world of massive raids with over 600 XP brews and 10 spirit brews. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. The ascension of Gustavus Adolphus to the throne of Sweden in 1611 is generally regarded as the starting point of the Swedish Empire. The able young king inherited a multitude of conflicts in the region, most notably the Ingrian War against the Tsardom of Russia. The war was concluded with the Peace of Stolbovo in 1618, which stipulated that Sweden would gain Ingria and parts of Karelia, thereby denying Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Russia, which was still recovering from the time of troubles, was unable to offer any significant resistance to Swedish expansion. The war with Poland-Lithuania, which had been sporadically raging on since 1600, was concluded in 1629. Gustavus Adolphus was not able to force Sigismund III of Poland to renounce his claims on the Swedish throne, but he was able to keep most of Livonia, including the important port city of Riga, and gain valuable trade concessions. In 1618, one of the most destructive conflicts in history, the 30 Years' War, had started as well. Although the last phases of the Swedish-Polish War are considered to be a part of the 30 Years' War, the Kingdom of Sweden did not involve itself directly in the war before the King of Denmark, the former champion of Protestantism, had been defeated. Worried about Catholic domination in the empire, Gustavus Adolphus, who was a leader of a Protestant nation himself, intervened on the Protestant side. Although the Catholics were close to a complete victory, the Swedish involvement changed the tides of the war. Sweden's superior army dominated the battlefield even after the death of Gustavus, and by 1648, the war was grinding down to a stalemate. Large parts of Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, were left decimated demographically, economically, and militarily. In contrast, the Kingdom of Sweden, by acquiring territories in Pomerania and Bremen-Verden at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, became the preeminent power in the Baltic region and one of Europe's leading states. Sweden may have been the dominant power in Northern and Eastern Europe. However, its supremacy in the Baltic was incomplete. Only several years after the Peace of Westphalia, they went to war against Poland in what became known as the Deluge. Even though the Swedes were dominating for most of the war, by the end, the coalition assembled against them proved to be too difficult to deal with, and peace was signed. The peace was a merely symbolic victory for Sweden, as the Polish monarchs finally abandoned their claim to the Swedish throne.
I'm sorry for watching the video and not commenting. I'm just kind of enjoying it. And I just realized I haven't said anything, which I'm sure a few of you are happy with. But my contribution is this is good, and I don't want to spoil it, which is what I'm doing right now. So I'll get back to the video. I don't know any of this stuff, so I'm just taking it in.
Moreover, it also proved that the Kingdom of Sweden could not survive for too long against an organized coalition of enemies. Charles XI ascended to the throne of Sweden in 1660, and the majority of his rule was peaceful, barring the relatively short Scanian War of 1675 to 1679. During the war, Sweden managed to defeat Scania, but lost some of its lands in Germany, mostly due to the inefficiency of the army. After the war, Charles XI revitalized the economy and administration of Sweden. However, his most notable reforms were of a military nature. Those reforms aimed to make the Swedish army one of the best in Europe. Charles XI's death in 1697 left his only son, Charles XII, as the new Swedish king. As Charles XII was barely 15 at the time, Peter I of Russia and Christian V of Denmark saw this as an ideal opportunity to exploit Sweden's apparent weakness. On the 21st of April 1699, Russia and Denmark concluded a treaty of mutual assistance in future wars against Sweden. One of the secret articles of the treaty, however, stipulated that Russia would only join the war after it made peace with the Ottoman Empire. Shortly afterwards, Peter concluded.
Is that to make peace with the Ottoman Empire so that if Russia and Denmark go to war with Sweden, Sweden wouldn't entice the Ottomans to attack Russia? Or maybe the Ottomans just do it anyways? That's my guess.
A treaty with Augustus of Saxony, who was also the elected ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Augustus was a very proud and extravagant ruler, and his main goal was to return Livonia to the Commonwealth. Livonia, although a land that brought insurmountable wealth to the Swedish crown, was also a source of great concern. After Sweden had gained Livonia in 1629 through the Treaty of Altmark, it gave certain assurances to the old Livonian nobility that they would preserve the rights that they had had under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that they would not lose any of the lands that were in their possession. For the first couple of decades, the relationship between the Swedish monarchs and the Livonian nobility was amicable. Charles X, however, was not as lenient as his predecessors, and by 1655 he intended to revoke a quarter of the lands that belonged to the Livonian nobility, only with the Second Northern War preventing him from doing so.
Why did he want to do that? Just to be a dick?
Charles XI would turn his father's plans into a reality after ascending to the throne, and by the time of his death in 1697, the Livonian nobility held only a fifth of the original number of estates. One of the nobles, Johann Reinhold Patkul, outraged by the Great Reduction, agitated the Livonian nobility to rise up against Sweden in rebellion. He was swiftly arrested and sentenced to death, and to avoid execution, Patkul fled from Sweden. Patkul later played a key role in the formation of the anti-Swedish coalition, as he was usually the diplomatic link between Peter, Augustus and Christian, and provided intelligence on the Swedish defences in the Baltic. Sensing the impending danger, Charles XII sent diplomats to Russia in the summer of 1699, with the goal of confirming a peace treaty between the two states from 1661. A skillful diplomat, Peter the Great assured the envoys of his peaceful intentions, but in reality he had already decided to go to war. Augustus II also sent a diplomatic envoy to Sweden, assuring the king of his friendly intentions and asking for Swedish mediation in a dispute between himself and Prussia. While all of these dialogues took place, the coalition continued its preparations for war. Ultimately, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp became alarmed by the Danish naval buildup and informed his ally Charles XII of what had been transpiring. Though both the Swedes and Holstein had tried to resolve the matter peacefully, the new King of Denmark, Frederick IV, refused to negotiate. The first act of war was committed by Frederick's troops in March of 1700, when the Danish army entered lands belonging to the Duke of Holstein, and shortly afterwards laid siege to Tønning. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Baltic Sea, Saxon forces under Augustus entered Livonia and captured the port of Dunemunda. Charles XII, together with his war council, seeing the Danish threat as more immediate, decided to strike at them first. Great Britain and the Netherlands were uneasy at the prospect of a destructive war in the Baltic, as they had trade interests in the region. Fearing that the conflict might destabilize their economies, the maritime powers deployed their fleets to Øresund to ensure that no lasting harm to trade and their merchants would be done. By August, a Swedish force...
I love how countries... They consider how it's going to affect them and their trade back in the days. And every country did it. You know, America did it. But I just love how it was like, they're going to war. Uh-oh. It can't affect our trade. I just love how they just didn't care. As long as it didn't affect them, you know. Everyone was guilty of it.
16,000 had assembled in Scania. Though attacking the main Danish army and lifting the siege of Tønning seemed like the most secure way to deal a decisive defeat to Frederick IV, Charles opted for the riskier option of attacking the Danish mainland itself. The Swedish fleet, with Charles himself and his troops on board, managed to outmaneuver their more formidable Danish counterpart and make contact with the British and Dutch fleet. The maritime powers were willing to assist the Swedish king, so the Danish fleet was forced to retreat to Copenhagen.
Oh wow.
Skillfully avoiding parts of the island where coastal batteries were present,
So I'm guessing they helped Sweden because they were more trade partners with them over the Danish? Or the Dutch? Whatever.
Swedish troops subsequently disembarked on Zealand. The Danish mustered up around 700 men and
Oh, I went past where I wanted to go. Oh well. I'm going to go and end this here. And then I'll probably take it back to the beginning. It was... I mean, it's 4 minutes. I'm just going to go. We're going to roll with it. It's 15-minute mark.
And artillery pieces to attack the Swedish disembarking forces. Yeah. However, they were no match for the 2,500 Swedish soldiers led by Charles himself. It was here that Charles XII saw battle for the first time and proved himself an excellent leader, being the first one to jump into the water and lead the assault.
Wow.
The Danish were caught completely by surprise with this move and were starting to panic, as the Swedish army was within a stone's throw of their capital. A few days after Charles set foot on Zealand, more Swedish soldiers landed there as well, and preparations were made for the march on Copenhagen. Meanwhile, the Swedish, Dutch and British fleets blockaded and started bombarding Copenhagen from the sea. With Copenhagen surrounded on both...
So the two countries that were going down just to ensure that their trade wasn't interrupted have now involved themselves in the war. Okay.
Both land and sea, Frederick IV of Denmark made peace with the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and peace with Sweden was achieved soon afterwards as well. On the 18th of August 1700, the same day that peace was made between Denmark and Sweden, Peter I of Russia declared war on Sweden and began his offensive into Ingria. The first target of Peter the Great's campaign was Narva, a crucial fort near the Baltic Sea. Peter besieged Narva with an army more than 30,000 strong, and with...
What video game graphics are they using here? I'm guessing it always seems to be a video game, but what video game is this? This is really cool.
With more than 150 cannons. Such an artillery force would have reduced Narva to rubble, were it not for the fact that the Russians suffered from a lack of ammunition due to bad roads.
Yeah.
With trouble brewing in the west, in what would become the War of the Spanish Succession, the fleet of the maritime powers transported the Swedish army back to the mainland before setting sail westwards. As the Swedish army was fully united, Charles was able to set sail for Livonia. Though Dunamunda fell to Saxon forces quickly and with little resistance, Patkul gravely misjudged the loyalty and intentions of the Livonian nobility. He had expected the Livonian nobility to join Augustus and Riga to fall quickly too. However, Livonian support was minimal, and Saxon forces alone were not strong enough to take the city. Learning of the Danish defeat, Augustus II retreated across the Duna River in hope that Charles would agree to a ceasefire. Charles arrived with a part of his army in Pernau in autumn. As Augustus retreated beyond the Duna River for winter quarters, Charles decided to head towards Narva and the Russian army. The rest of the Swedish War Council, along with foreign emissaries, tried to persuade Charles to postpone the attack on the Russian army until after the winter had passed and the army was united. Charles, however, wished nothing other than to meet his enemy in open battle, and not even the knowledge of the size of the Russian army could dissuade him. While marching towards Narva on the 7th of November, a part of the Swedish army clashed with a Russian raiding party under the command of Boris Sheremetyev at Jõhvi. Although the Russian raiding party suffered relatively heavy casualties compared to the Swedish ones, General Sheremetyev became aware of how far the Swedish army was from Narva. On the 18th...
Was the Russian army not as well trained, not as well not prepared? They hadn't had the experience that Sweden had at this point. Like, if they had more numbers and they lost, then I'm just guessing that they just weren't as... Oh, sorry. I was talking to my dog. Sorry. I'm guessing they just didn't... The experience. That's what I'm trying to think. They didn't have the wartime experience that maybe Sweden had. Would that be the cause? That's kind of the only thing that was going through my head.
Of November, Charles XII arrived with his army at the village of Lagena, about 8 kilometers away from Narva. Seeing that many of the horses were ill and that there was heavy snowfall, he knew he needed to act quickly. As soon as he was certain that Narva had not fallen and that his men were ready, Charles left Lagena. Meanwhile...
Okay, I'm going to stop this here because it's going to start the battle. So I'm going to end this here and start back, and we'll get right into the battle, and we'll go from there. So this is going to be interesting for me, but until we get back into it, have a good day, have a good night.